Hello, everyone. My name is Dale Umbenhauer, and I'm a manager in Maley's Limerick office, specializing in government accounting. My presentation today is based on the new sources of federal revenues related to the COVID-19 pandemic and related single audit considerations. For some of you, single audits are nothing new, and you're familiar with the process. For others, you may never have had a single audit done before and are not familiar with the process. Today, we'll take a look at each one of the new acts that provide federal funding and see how they relate to you. There's something for everyone in here, so let's get started. These are the course learning objectives that I've come up with. By the end of the course, you should be able to gain an understanding of the various streams of revenue and be able to identify those applicable to your entity. You should be able to gain an understanding of the single audit requirements and the related governance, and gain an understanding of the compliance requirements and how they relate to your funding. As I said, there's new sources of federal funding. There's 5. There are 4 from 2020, and then the very last one happened in 2021. We're going to take a look at each one of them and how they relate to each of you. So the first one, the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act, provided $8.3 billion in emergency funding to federal agencies. Now, this one was put into law in January of 2020, right after the pandemic hit. So there was no provisions in there for local governments. The second act, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, provided $500 million to the Department of Agriculture for emergency food assistance in accordance with the Commodity Assistance Program. It also created nutrition waivers, allowing free meals to all students through existing programs through the Maintaining Essential Access to Lunch for Students program. The Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or CARES Act, is the next piece of legislation that we're going to look at. This provided additional funding for child nutrition programs of $8.8 billion and additional funding for the commodity assistance programs of $450 million. It also provided $850 million for a coronavirus emergency supplemental funding program, and these awards went mostly to people who were eligible for the JAG grants through the Department of Justice. One of the main things that the CARES Act did was it amended the Social Security Act and added Section 5, the Coronavirus Relief Fund. This provided $150 billion for state, territory, tribal, and certain local governments. Now, it's important to point out here that the local governments I'm referring to are those with populations of 500,000 people or more. Another thing that the CARES Act did was it provided $30.75 billion to create an education stabilization fund. The two main parts of this fund are the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund grants, or GEER, and the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund grants, or ESSER. Now, the GEER grants were allocated to state governors and were meant to provide emergency support to local education agencies, or LEAs, emergency support to institutions of higher education, and there's also some miscellaneous provisions for additional education-related support, like Head Start programs. The ESSER grants were allocated to the state educational agencies, i.e. the Pennsylvania Department of Education, and they in turn had to make subgrants to LEAs equal to at least 90% of the total amount that they received. The next act, the Paycheck Protection Program and Healthcare Enhancement Act, provided additional emergency appropriations for Paycheck Protection Program loans and other provisions for healthcare related entities. This one also did not make any provisions for local governments. Now, here's the granddaddy, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, or the ARP. $1.9 trillion. And to begin with, it built on previous acts, the FFCRA and the CARES Act. It provided $350 billion in state and local aid. And that was broken down as follows. $195.3 billion for states and Washington, D.C. That started as $500 million to each state right up front, and then the other $169 billion was allocated based on the state's unemployment. The ARP also gave $130.2 billion to local governments, and that was broken down as $65.1 billion for counties, $45.6 billion for metropolitan cities like Philadelphia, and $19.5 billion for towns with fewer than 50,000 residents. Now let's talk about the impact of all this federal funding. Governmental entities may now be subject to a single audit for the first time. If you expend $750,000 or more in a fiscal year of federal funds, then you're subject to the single audit. And that includes both an audit of the financial statements and the federal awards. So you're probably already very familiar with the audit of the financial statements. So the difference would be the audit of the federal awards. And what that does is it reviews how the grant was managed, and it ensures that the funds were properly spent. I want to point out here that you might receive funds directly from a federal agency like the Department of Justice, or it might be passed through another entity like the Pennsylvania Department of Education. Pass-through entity funding is funding that's provided by a non-federal entity to a subrecipient to carry out a federal program. This may mean that you are a subrecipient. There are some nuances between subrecipient versus contractor that I'm going to go over now. Now let's talk a little bit about pass-through entity requirements. Some of the requirements for pass-through awards, and you should see this information on any award that you get from a pass-through agency. The sub-award needs to be clearly identified as such. It needs to include a federal award identification number. It needs to include the federal award date and the period of performance. It needs to provide the assistance listing number, formerly CFDA number, and the related title. It also has to note whether or not you're subject to the single audit requirements and any additional requirements that may be imposed by the pass-through entity. Here we take a look at some of the nuances between a subrecipient versus a contractor. A subrecipient is a non-federal entity that receives a subaward from a pass-through entity to carry out a federal program. Some of the characteristics of a subrecipient is that you'll be making eligibility decisions. You'll have responsibility for overall decision-making regarding programming, and you utilize the federal funding to carry out the program for public purposes. A contractor, on the other hand, is an entity that receives a contract to provide goods and services related to carrying out the federal program. So some of the characteristics of a contractor are: it is in the business of providing similar goods and services to other entities. It operates in a competitive environment, and it's not subject to UG requirements. For the single audit, we have 3 levels of requirements. We have generally accepted auditing standards, which are promulgated by the AICPA, and with that comes the independent auditor's report. We also have government auditing standards, aka the Yellow Book, which is promulgated by the General Accounting Office. And for that, we issue an independent auditor's report and internal control over financial reporting in accordance with government auditing standards. The third level of requirements is the uniform guidance, which is promulgated by the OMB, or the Office of Management and Budget. For that, we issue a report called the Independent Auditor's Report on Compliance and Controls in accordance with the uniform guidance. Now I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about government auditing standards, because this will be something new for most of you. Government auditing standards really only come into play when you have a program or single audit. There are specific requirements related to government auditing standards that surround independence, ethics, continuing professional education, quality control and peer review, and standards for financial audits and fieldwork. Most of these requirements are a bit more strict than their counterparts in the GASB or the FASB. Here's some basics on the uniform guidance. Previously known as a Circular A133 audit, it was changed to uniform guidance for periods after December 26, 2014. It's codified in Title II of the CFR, Subtitle A, Chapter 2, Part 200. From here on out, we'll just refer to it as Part 200. The part has several subparts, the first subpart A being acronyms and definitions. Subpart B is just general information. Subpart C relates to pre-awards, and this is directed towards the federal agencies. Subpart D is post-awards and is directed towards you, the recipients. Subpart E is the cost principles, which we'll go over in a little more detail in a few minutes. And Subpart F is related to the audit requirements. There are also appendices 1 through 12, and Appendix 11 is the actual compliance supplement that we'll talk about in a few minutes. The objectives of a uniform guidance audit are to ensure the financial statements and the CFA are fairly stated in all material respects in accordance with generally accepted auditing principles. This is important because this is included in our report. So we're saying we are opining on that, so we have to ensure that it's actually true. The other objective is to ensure compliance with each directed material compliance requirement for each major program. This provides assurance to users regarding an entity's internal controls over compliance. Now we'll talk a little bit about the auditee and the auditor responsibilities in relation to a uniform guidance audit. Auditee responsibilities include you have to arrange for a single audit to be performed in accordance with the standards. There are procurement standards in section 200.317 to 200.326 that surround the selection of an auditor to perform the single audit. As part of your arrangement to have a single audit performed, you must obtain and review a copy of the peer review report of the auditor. The next responsibility for the auditee is to establish and maintain effective internal controls over federal programs. These policies and procedures must be written, and they must include internal controls over the federal programs. So your existing controls over accounts payable may be operating effectively, but you need to ensure that they also cover the federal program expenditures, and that includes making sure that the expenditure is allowable under the grant guidance. You're also required to comply with applicable laws and conditions of the federal awards, and you have to monitor and evaluate your compliance with the requirements and take appropriate action when necessary. Auditee responsibilities also include preparation of the financial statements, preparation of the CFA, corrective action plan and follow-up, and completion of applicable elements of the data collection form, i.e. certification. We'll go over the preparation of the data collection form later in the program, and you'll see where you come into play with regards to certifying the information. The corrective action plan will only be required if there are any findings with result to the testing of the single audit. Preparation of financial statements and the preparation of CFA can both be completed by your auditor as a non-attest service as long as it's appropriately documented. I also want to take a few minutes now to talk about low risk versus high risk auditee. Each of you will be determined to be either a low risk or a high risk auditee based on an analysis that your auditor performs. This is based on things like whether or not you've had an audit conducted in the last 2 years, and if you have, whether or not there were any findings with relation to that audit. Most of you, like I said, is going to be a new single audit with relation to this new federal funding. So you will automatically be a high risk auditee because you've not had a single audit performed in the last 2 years. Now let's take a look at auditor responsibilities under the Uniform Grant Audit. Our responsibilities include to perform an audit of the financial statements in accordance with generally accepted auditing standards from the AICPA and the government auditing standards. We need to determine whether the financial statements are fairly presented and whether the CFA is fairly presented. We need to gain an understanding of internal control over federal programs and plan the audit to support the assessed level of control risk and perform testing of internal controls. Remember, as a condition of receiving federal funds, you agree to comply with laws, regulations, and the provisions of grant agreements and contracts, and to also maintain internal control to provide reasonable assurance of compliance with these requirements. We also determine whether the auditee has complied with applicable laws and conditions of the federal awards. And to do that, we perform testing of compliance for each applicable area from the compliance matrix, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. We only do testing of compliance requirement areas that are direct and material to the audit. More of our responsibilities are to follow up on any prior year audit findings, report any current year findings from testing compliance and internal controls over compliance, and we have to complete the applicable elements of the data collection form, aka certification, just like the auditee will have to complete as well. Now let's go over some single audit basics. The first order of business with regards to a single audit is preparation of the schedule of expenditures of federal awards, or the CFA. This is the responsibility of the auditee to prepare, although the auditor can help in certain circumstances under non-attest services. Some of the requirements of the CFA are that it has to list each individual program by federal agency and assistance listing number, formerly the CFDA, or Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance. If funds were received as a subrecipient, you have to name the pass-through entity and provide an additional grant number from the pass-through entity. You have to list the total amount expended for each individual program, and that must be able to be reconciled to your accounting records under the uniform guidance. The total amount passed through to subrecipients is also required, whether or not the amount is zero. This is where you have to make a determination of whether or not it's a subrecipient versus a beneficiary. And we'll talk about those status later in the program. Here, I just wanted to include a sample of a schedule of expenditures of federal awards, or CFA, and you'll see that we list by the federal agency. Here is the United States Department of Agriculture, passed through the state of Delaware Department of Education. We include the federal CFDA number, the pass-through identifying number, the federal expenditures, and we disclose the fact that we pass nothing through to subrecipients. The CFA also has some disclosures that are required to go along with it. First is that if you have any loan or loan guarantee programs, you must disclose those in the notes to the CFA. Secondly, you must disclose your significant accounting policies used in preparing the CFA. Some folks prepare their CFA on the cash basis, while their other books are on the accrual basis of accounting. In this case, we'll need to add a reconciliation that gets us from the cash basis CFA to the accrual basis financial statements. You also need to disclose whether or not you decided to use the de minimis indirect cost rate allowed by the uniform guidance of 10%, or whether you did not decide to use that indirect cost rate. Risk assessment and major program determination. There are two types of programs, Type A and Type B. The Type A programs are anything that is $750,000 or more. And for those of you who haven't had a single audit done in quite some time, you might remember this number as being $500,000 under the old guidance. Type B programs are everything else that's less than $750,000. Major programs are those that are required to be tested after the risk assessment process is complete. The risk assessment process focuses on large programs, risky programs like those from the HUD, and new programs, which are the ones that we're talking about here today. The next step in the process is major program determination. And this is prescribed in the uniform guidance, and it's based on the size, risks, and age of the program. There are 4 program levels: high risk Type A, low risk Type A, high risk Type B, and low risk Type B. Let's take a look at the compliance requirements. There are 12 compliance requirements in the matrix, and they are as follows. The first one is activities allowed and unallowed. So what this basically says is, what are you allowed to spend the grant money on? And in the case of each of these new funding revenue sources, they are to prevent, prepare for, or respond to the coronavirus pandemic. So those are your allowed activities. Allowable costs and cost principles, as laid out in the Uniform Guidance Subpart E, are those costs that are incurred to carry out the activities of preparing, preventing, or responding to the coronavirus pandemic. There are a few basic guidelines for federal expenditures, and they are that they must be necessary and reasonable for the performance of the federal award, and they have to be able to be allocated to that federal award under Subpart E. They have to conform to any limitations or exclusions set forth in the part as to the types or amount of cost items. They must be consistent with your own policies and procedures that apply uniformly to both federally financed and your other activities, meaning you can't account for your federal expenditures one way and account for your other expenditures in a different way. The expenditures must also be accorded consistent treatment. And what this means is it can't be accounted for as a direct expense on one line item and be included as an indirect expense on another line item. They also have to be determined to be in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, and they cannot be included as a cost or used to meet cost sharing or matching requirements. The last requirement is that they must be adequately documented. Now, the next item on the list is cash management. And this basically comes into play if you receive any money in advance for a grant. And what it's saying is that you must minimize the time between the amount that you come into possession of the federal funds and the amount that you expend them in accordance with the program. Now, when we get to the compliance matrix with regards to each of the new laws, we'll see that cash management does not really come into play with these. The next requirement on the listing is eligibility, and that is who's eligible to participate in the grant program. Well, depending on which act it is determines who's eligible, and we'll go over each one of those in more detail. Equipment and real property management. This compliance requirement comes into play if you purchase equipment or real property with federal funds. Matching level of effort and earmarking comes into play if these specific requirements are listed in the compliance supplement. So matching is pretty much self-explanatory. You may receive a grant from an organization or a federal agency of, say, $50,000 if you provide a match of another $50,000. So the matching requirement there would be 50%. Level of effort comes into play mostly with school districts that are on the call today, but sometimes with other entities as well. And what that is you have to maintain a certain level of effort with regards to your federal programs, with or without the federal money. Earmarking is something that we discussed already, whereas if you remember, I said that the State Department of Education had to earmark 90% of those funds received for grants to the local education agencies. The next one is the period of performance, and this is the period in which the grant funds can be spent. Now we'll go over each one individually because each grant has different periods of performance. The next item is procurement, suspension, and debarment. So procurement, as you can imagine, means that you have to follow certain protocols when it comes to spending money on certain projects like capital expenditures or service-related items. Suspension and debarment means that you can't do business with an entity who is suspended or debarred from the federal government. So you have to go to the website and determine whether or not any vendor that you're thinking of doing business with is on the suspended and debarment listing, because if it is and you do business with them, those costs become unallowed and will be reported in the auditor's report. The next item, program income. This comes from any interest earned on funding that is received in advance of spending the money. It also can come into play if you have a program like a UDAG program in which you receive interest income in addition to receiving principal payments. The next compliance requirement, reporting, is basically just how it sounds. Each grant has different reporting requirements. Some of them are financial, some of them are performance related. The next compliance requirement, subrecipient monitoring, we're going to go over in more detail here in the next slide. The last item on the list is special tests and provisions, and this is where the OMB decided to stick everything they couldn't find another place to put. Now let's talk about subrecipient monitoring. It is applicable in some of the new funding sources and not in others. The single audit requirements apply to both the pass-through entity and the subrecipient. And there are some additional requirements here for the pass-through entities with regards to subrecipient monitoring. First of all, you have to identify the award and the applicable requirements. And then you have to evaluate the risk of your subrecipient. How do you do that? There are a couple different factors that you can use. One is prior experience with the program. So has your subrecipient received this funding before? You know, most of you are subrecipients of the Department of Education, and you have been for years. So you have a significant amount of prior experience with programs. Also, a factor is results of previous audits. So did you have any findings in the previous audits, or were they clean audits? Substantially new or changed systems or operations. So for instance, did everyone in a management position quit and you had to hire all new people for the year? So that's a substantially changed operations. Systems, did you change over to a new accounting system? You also have to include the results of your monitoring activities as a factor in your evaluation. Here are a few more requirements for subrecipient monitoring by the pass-through entities. So the pass-through entity is required to monitor the activities of the subrecipient as necessary to ensure compliance. And how you can do that is by reviewing the required financial and program reports, following up on any previously identified deficiencies or findings, and evaluate and determine needed action for any audit findings noted by the auditor. The pass-through entity is also required to ensure accountability of any for-profit recipients. These for-profit subrecipients are not subject to the Subpart F audit requirements. So the pass-through entity needs to ensure compliance with award requirements. Here is an example of the matrix from the compliance supplement. And this lists the 12 compliance requirements along with the new federal funding for the new grants. Now we're going to take a look at the new acts that apply to us and the application of them under the Uniform Guidance. The Families First Coronavirus Response Act provided funding under current programs to the Department of Agriculture under the Commodity Assistance Program and the nutrition waivers. This act did not create any new programs, and the funding was all delivered through the current programs through the Department of Agriculture. Testing for this will be similar to it has been in the past. Application to the CARES Act, on the other hand, provides some funding through the current programs, child nutrition programs, and the commodity assistance programs, but it also created a new program in the Department of Justice, Assistance Number 16.034, Coronavirus Emergency Supplemental Funding. You see here I added the portion of the matrix related to assistance listing number 16.034. Now, if there is a Y, that means that the requirement is applicable or at least needs to be analyzed to determine if it's applicable. If there's a no, that means that the auditor is not required to do any testing over that requirement. The activities allowed and unallowed for listing number 16.034 are to ensure that funds must be used to prevent, prepare for, or respond to the coronavirus. Certain purchases, and it's defined as those over $500,000, require prior approval from the cognizant agency or the pass-through entity. Administrative costs cannot exceed 10% of the total award, and the award money must not be used to supplant state or local funds. Allowable costs and cost principles for this program are those that are necessary to carry out the allowable activities: hiring, training, and overtime of employees, travel costs, equipment, and supplies such as gloves, masks, and sanitizer are a few of the allowable costs under this program. For equipment and real property management, refer to the Department of Justice Grants Financial Guide, Section 3.7, and that lays out in detail what equipment and or real property can be purchased with the grant funding and how it needs to be accounted for. Procurement and suspension and debarment must follow the Uniform Guidance standards for procurement, and that includes items such as bidding and going out to RFP for certain services and goods. Program income requirements relate to funds received in advance, and it says that they must be placed in an interest-bearing account separate from your other funds. The interest must also be used to carry out allowable activities, which is preparing for, preventing, or responding to the coronavirus pandemic. For this program, there are two reports required. The first one is the SF 425 Federal Financial Report, and the second are the semi-annual progress reports or performance reports that are due under the program. The CARES Act also created the Coronavirus Relief Fund, or assistance listing number 21.019. Here we see the matrix for the Coronavirus Relief Fund, and we see here again that cash management is not applicable. With regards to the Coronavirus Relief Fund, the allowed and unallowable activities are: the expenditures must be necessary due to the public health emergency with respect to COVID-19. They must not have already been budgeted for in your most recently approved budget as of March 27, 2020. And they must have been incurred during the period from March 1st, 2020 through December 31st, 2020. Now, this was extended to December 31st, 2021 by the ARP Act. Allowable costs and cost principles. Now, I want to point out here that the Act specifically excludes this funding from Subpart E cost principles. So we have to then determine based on other cost principles. And basically the overriding principle here is that the acquisition must be necessary due to the public health emergency. Examples of allowable costs are medical expenses, public health expenses, and payroll expenses for those employees whose services are substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. It also includes expenses incurred to facilitate compliance with public health measures and expenses related to providing economic support in connection with the public health emergency, such as grants to small businesses for business interruptions. The period of performance, as I said, was extended, so it goes from March 1st, 2020 to December 31st of 2021. The reporting requirements are a quarterly financial progress report of the total funds received, a detailed listing of all the projects and activities, and the amount expended or obligated for each activity. It also needs to include detailed information related to loans and grants issued. Next portion of the CARES Act that we're going to look at is the Education Stabilization Fund, and this is assistance listing number 84.425. There are 4 subcategories under this heading, and they are 84.425A, which is the ESF State Educational Agency grants, and those are for the outlying areas such as Puerto Rico and the territories. There are the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund grants, or GEER, which is 84.425C. We then have 84.425D, which is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief, or ESSER funds. And we also have 84.425H, which is the Education Stabilization Fund for governors for the outlying areas of Puerto Rico, the territories, etc. Here we have the matrix for this program. And again, anything that's listed with a Y is applicable, and anything that's listed with a no is not. As you'll see, cash management is applicable to this funding. Activities allowed and unallowed. These are going to be broken down between the 2 different funds because the requirements are different depending on which fund we're talking about. With related to these fundings, I'm only going to talk about the GEER funds and the ESSER funds because the other 2 sub-programs that I discussed are for the outlying areas, which none of you are in. So the activities allowed for the GEER fund is to support the ability of the local education association to continue to provide education services to students. And it also is to support the ability of education-related entities to provide emergency educational services and provision of child care and early childhood education. I know there's currently some conflicts with regards to the differing guidance for the GEER fund expenditures, or some of the guidance is saying that payroll costs are eligible, and other guidance is saying that payroll costs are not eligible. So this appears to be a moving target, and you should discuss this with your auditor when the time comes. The ESSER funds has 12 allowable activities. These are all spelled out in the compliance supplement, and basically what they boil down to is that the costs have to be necessary to maintain the operation of and continuity of service in a local education association and continuing to employ staff of the LEA in order to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. You see the trend here. everything is supposed to be for the prevention, preparation for, and response to the COVID-19 pandemic. You should refer to the December 2020 addendum to the compliance supplement when it comes to the allowable activities and costs for these funds. Allowable costs for the GEAR and ESSER programs are laid out in subpart E of the uniform guidance. And here, it's important to note that this says that the time distribution records will not need to be maintained, although I'm told that folks from the OMB are saying that that is not true and that time records do need to be maintained. Cash management. This includes requirements surrounding the timing of receipt and the expenditure of federal awards that I already discussed. You should refer to the August 2020 Compliance Supplement Part 3, Section C with regards to the cash management requirements. Equipment and real property management. These funds may be used to purchase equipment and real property, although prior approval from the Department of Education or the pass-through entity may be required. They must be necessary, again, to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the coronavirus 19 pandemic. And they must be required to have an inventory tracking system to be able to track the federal assets. Matching level of effort and earmarking are applicable only to the state. And what that says is they must distribute at least 90% of the ESSER funds to the local education associations. The amount received should be in proportion to the amount received for Title I programs in the 1920 school year. This program has some reporting requirements with regards to Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act. It applies only to the direct recipients, which is the states, although subawards of $30,000 or more must be reported using the FAFATA subaward reporting system. Now we're going to talk about the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 and how the uniform guidance applies to that. The first thing the ARP Act did was it created a coronavirus local fiscal recovery fund. Assistance under this fund is limited to 75% of the most recent budget as of January 27, 2020. It has not yet been assigned an assistance number, and it is not yet included in the most recent addendum to the compliance supplement. Treasury has not yet issued any statutory guidance on it, although I'm told it's due this month. So what we're going to do is we're going to refer to the Act itself for our requirements. Information that we're going to go over now is taken directly from the Act as presented by the House of Representatives. There are some pre-award requirements, and that is that each recipient must have a valid DUNS number, or Data Universal Numbering System. The allowed activities are the mitigation of fiscal effects of the public health emergency related to COVID-19. Here's an example of some of the allowable costs, and as you can see, it's pretty much wide open as to what the money can be used for. So the first item is assistance to households, small businesses, and nonprofits to deal with COVID-19 and negative economic impacts. It's also to provide aid to impacted industries such as tourism, travel, and hospitality to deal with the COVID-19 and negative economic impacts. It provides premium pay to eligible workers performing essential work related to COVID-19. You can think of these as the frontline workers. It provides assistance to eligible employers that have eligible workers who perform essential duties. Assistance for the provision of government services that have been impacted by COVID-19. Assistance for necessary investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. One thing that I want to point out here is very important. Funds may not be used to deposit in any pension fund. The period of performance is the funds will be available through December 31st, 2024. Reporting, it just says that periodic reports providing a detailed accounting of uses of funds and additional information may be required by the Treasury Secretary. So again, with regards to this, I want to point out that again, this is a moving target. Treasury has not yet issued any statutory guidance or even assigned an assistance listing number. Single audit materiality. This is something that's very important in the completion of a single audit, and it's calculated differently and separately from financial statement audit materiality. It is determined individually for each major program, and it's dependent on the nature of the compliance requirements, the nature and frequency of identified non-compliance, the needs and expectations of oversight agency and pass-through entities. Now let's talk about single audit testing, and we'll first talk about the tests of compliance. So an auditor is required to perform tests of compliance based on the direct and material requirements noted in the matrix. A sampling form is used to ensure proper coverage, and sample sizes based on program materiality and the size, complexity, and risk assessment of the program. We're also required to test internal controls over compliance. And as I mentioned earlier, processes need to be designed and implemented to provide reasonable assurance regarding the effectiveness and efficiency of your operations, the reliability of reporting for external and internal use, and compliance with applicable laws and regulations. Here again, a sampling form is used to ensure proper coverage, although this form is based on expected errors. Typically, dual testing of both compliance and controls is performed in an audit, and the higher sample size of the two forms that are used is the sample size that is used for the testing. After the single audit is all complete, that brings us to the communications and opinions portion of the audit. An independent auditor's report on internal control over financial reporting in accordance with government auditing standards. And this looks at the internal controls over financial reporting. There are 3 levels of deficiencies that could be reported in this independent auditor's report. They are a control deficiency, a significant deficiency, or a material weakness. We're also in this report required to disclose any non-compliance or other matters in accordance with government auditing standards. Now keep in mind, this is not the same as non-compliance with the uniform guidance. The other report that is issued as part of the single audit is the independent auditor's report on compliance and controls in accordance with the uniform guidance. And what this does is it provides an opinion on your compliance for each major federal program, and it also provides assurance over your internal controls over compliance. Now let's talk about the data collection form. As I mentioned earlier, we both, auditee and auditor, have some responsibilities when it comes to preparing this form. It is reported using the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, and it's important to note that each user will need an account with the clearinghouse. So if you don't already have one, you should get one set up for whoever is going to be your single audit liaison. As I mentioned prior, the data collection form is both the responsibility of the auditee and the auditor, and includes contact information for both certifying parties. It includes a listing of all the federal programs by assistance listing number, amount expended, and audit results for each major program. It also includes a summary of the audit results. Here is a snippet from the actual CFA that will be printed from the clearinghouse website after the initial information is entered. I'm not going to go over each one of these items individually. You can take a look at them for yourselves and see kind of what's involved. The reporting package is the very last piece of the puzzle, and that is after the completion of the data collection form. These are the required elements of the reporting package. The independent auditor's report on the financial statements, including an in relation to report on the CFA, a copy of the financial statements that includes the CFA, the independent auditor's report on internal controls over financial reporting and on compliance and other matters in accordance with government auditing standards. It needs to include the independent auditor's report on compliance and internal controls over compliance under the uniform guidance. It needs to include the independent auditor's schedule of findings and question costs. That includes any current year findings. It also documents whether or not you're a low risk or high risk auditee and the threshold for type A, type B programs. A summary schedule of prior audit findings, if applicable, is also required. And what that lists is prior year audit findings and the current year status. So if you have a finding in the prior year, in the current year, the auditor is required to take a look at that finding and see if it still applies. Another required element of the reporting package is the corrective action plan, if applicable. So if you have a current year finding, you need to come up with a corrective action plan to resolve that finding. And best practice is that it should be on your letterhead. Another required element is the data collection form that we just discussed preparing. And all this is due to the clearinghouse within the earlier of 30 days after receipt of the independent auditor's report, or 9 months after the end of the period under audit. For instance, if you're a December 31st year end, your single audit will be due within 30 days after the completion of the audit, or by September 30th, 2021. Here are some key information and resources related to the topics that we went over today. As you can see, they're all links, so each one of them will take you directly to the item that it describes. So for the uniform guidance, I've provided the link directly to the Part 200 that deals with the uniform guidance. I've also included a link to the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations, and this will take you to what is called the Super Circular, or the Part 200. I've included links to both the August 2020 and December 2020 versions of the compliance supplement, because the 2020 version is an amendment that must be used in conjunction with the August 2020 version. It is not a standalone version. More key information and resources are, I provided a link for the Government Auditing Standards, aka the Yellow Book, and I also provided a link to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse so that you can go on there and create your account and get ready for your portion of the data collection form process. Here we have links to the 3 acts that we discussed that are related to local government funding. These links will take you directly to the acts themselves and not to any kind of summary. I want to thank you for attending my presentation today, and I hope you got something out of it. Thank you and have a great day.